Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome to Blitz through the Ancient Near East. In this lecture, I'm going to cover the entire movement from people's first building civilizations in the ancient world until close to the coming of Jesus Christ. We're going to cover several thousand years and then however many thousand years took place before people began in Egypt and in Mesopotamia to organize themselves into what will eventually be empires or at least kingdoms. And what takes place essentially from the Stone Ages, so we're going back thousands of years to the dawn of history. And history begins in the ancient Near East around 3000 BC. And we're going to see civilizations arise again in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. But for those civilizations to be able to arise, several processes had to take place. So hunter-gatherers, nomadic peoples, had to move from just collecting food to actually producing food through agriculture and animal husbandry. Now, they could still be nomadic, but eventually people begin to settle down. And again, we want to note that these processes can go back and forth depending on circumstances. So it is possible for a nomadic people to settle, and then after some difficult events, then move back and become nomadic again. And also people groups could be nomadic parts of the year and sedentary parts of the year. But eventually people settle down, and that's how large groups of people begin to live together in cities and then to build kingdoms and eventually empires. The production of pottery was critical in the development of large amounts of people living together because pottery allowed food to be collected and stored safely from the elements. Irrigation, especially in Mesopotamia, we're going to see in Egypt that the Nile River flooded almost or so consistently that you could almost set a clock by it or your calendar by it. But in Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates River, modern-day Iraq, those rivers flooded sporadically, and so irrigation canals were needed to be able to leverage the water so the crops could be grown on a mass scale. Urbanization and specialization, as people began to build cities, and we have remains at Jericho, for example, that date back to 8000 BC, you begin to get people living together in cities, and these aren't mega metropolises like a New York City. They're very small cities, a couple of acres. But specializations arose in these places, and no specialization was more important than metallurgy. And that's the process of building tools and weapons out of harder and harder metals. And we're going to see that the ages, we're going to have the Bronze Age, and then we're going to have the Iron Age, is that the production of certain kinds of metal, which allowed the production of excellent tools and weapons, really drove the advances that we see in ancient culture. And also writing shows up around 3500. Again, this would be for mostly economic purposes, though we will see very soon thereafter literary text as people begin to capture their stories. And there are copies, and we've been findings of narratives and poetry and royal annals from around the ancient Near East that are older, in some cases older than the scriptures themselves. So let's start with the early Bronze Age, and what this lecture is going to do, it's going to move around between Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Syria, Palestine. And so let's start with Mesopotamia during the early Bronze Age. The Sumerians were the earliest people group to begin to build what we would call a civilization. As you can see from the dates, the Sumerians reigned for almost 800 years in city-states in southern Iraq. And the Sumerians spoke an Indo-European language, and they ruled from city-states. And some of the city-states like Ur are going to be familiar with us because that's the city that Abraham is said to have come out of. So these city-states go back into the 3rd millennia. Sumerians also had kings and kingship, and that's going to be a theme that we're going to see all the way through the ancient Near Eastern history. In fact, there's a document of the Sumerian kings list that claims that some of their kings lived for thousands of years. In a way, that Sumerian Kings list document is backdrop for, say, Genesis 5, where we have a genealogy that has some of the Israel's ancestors living hundreds of years. And in that case, Genesis 5 looks quite modest compared to the claims of how long some of the Sumerian kings reigned. Also, the Sumerians were responsible for high culture, and this was thought to be a golden age. And one of the phenomena that you'll see when you study ancient history as that's distinct from, say, a modern Western view of reality is modern Westerners tend to look forward and be optimistic, or at least until recently they were optimistic about the future. In the ancient world, people looked backwards to the good old days, to golden eras. And so Sumerian culture begins to reflect that. Let's look at Mesopotamia. Continue. After the Sumerians, we have a group called the Akkadians. The Akkadians are significant for a couple of reasons. They have two rulers. I won't say they're famous because you may not have heard of them, but they were famous in the ancient Near East, Sargon the Great and Naram-Sin. Both of these gentlemen were significant because both of these persons showed an appetite for conquest and adventure. And Sargon will give his name to several rulers, including a Assyrian king, much all the way into the first millennia, that will be significant in tension with the Israelite history. But both of these kings claim to be the kings of the four compass points and claim to have taken long journeys of conquest, perhaps even reaching the Mediterranean Sea. And they had this quest then for a world empire, and that's going to be a theme that's going to repeat over and over again in our survey of the ancient Near East, as one people group seeks to dominate another in terms of economics and sometimes just pure terror. Let's go to Egypt now. In Egypt, this is the Old Kingdom period, and the Old Kingdom Egypt was the union of Upper and Lower Egypt. So the two regions, the Delta region and then the upriver part of Egypt, they were united under a pharaoh. This, believe it or not, is where the Great Pyramids come from. So the Giza Pyramid and other massive structures date back to this. And this is significant because this is before any of Israel's ancestors appear on the scene. And that's one of the themes that we need to see in this lecture. When we look at setting the Old Testament in its context, we need to recognize that the Israelites are late comers to history. And so the Great Pyramids are there long before God's going to call Abram. The Egyptians had a writing system of hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics literally means priestly writing, but these were the writings that were found all over Israel's great monuments that were later deciphered in the modern period when the Rosetta Stone was found. In Syria, Palestine during this time, there were some big cities, Jericho, Megiddo. These were city-states, and we're not going to say too much about them, but the highlights of the early Bronze period was that this was the golden age of culture. Again, later civilizations will look back on these civilizations as the high points. Also, we can see the beginning of a trend towards world domination, in particular with the Akkadians. And Israel, again, Israel's ancestors are there somewhere. Again, the world of Genesis 1 to 11 is the backdrop for the calling of Abram, but Abram isn't on the scene yet, so we have to say Israel's just a question mark, though obviously the people carrying the DNA of Abram are already in the ancient Near East at this time. All right, the second period of the late Bronze Age is what's known as Middle Bronze. And the Middle Bronze era, we'll start in Mesopotamia, begins with the Ur III dynasty. It immediately followed the Akkadians. And this is, not a lot is known about the Ur III. This has to do with a strata that was found in Ur. And it's thought that these were the last, kind of the last hurrah of the Sumerians. So these would be the last of the Sumerian dynasties that, again, briefly held power after the Akkadians. Now, this is the time period in the Middle Bronze where we can probably locate Abram, or Abraham as he's later known, in Genesis 17, and Isaac and Jacob. in the sense that there was lots of migrations in this time. Again, this doesn't prove Abram as a true historical figure, but it does make sense that a person such as Abraham it would have made sense, his story, within the context of Middle Bronze. We also see in Middle Bronze the rise of the city of Babylon. And one of Babylon's early famous rulers was a person named Hammurabi, around 1750. And as you probably have heard, this is a truly famous figure. Hammurabi is well known because of his law code. And Hammurabi's law code, you can look it up on Google, has some parallels with laws that we see in the Old Testament, and give some context for it. The Hittites also appeared during the Middle Bronze period. The Hittites, and probably the most famous Hittite was Uriah the Hittite, the person whom David murdered so that he could marry Uriah's wife Bathsheba. But the Hittites came out of the region of modern Turkey, and they were very important in Middle Bronze, and we'll see that they are also going to be significant in Late Bronze in their conflicts with the Egyptians, but they're famous in this period for sacking Babylon around 1600, near the end of this period. Egypt during Middle Bronze has a couple things that we'll mention. Several times in Egyptian history, there's what's known as intermediate periods. Again, people are living during this time, but there's no centralized authority, so that Egypt is broken up into competing pharaohs, competing regions, and so historians tend to just kind of broad brushstroke these times and not say a lot, and we're not going to say a whole lot because it really doesn't affect the way that we're reading the scriptures. The Middle Kingdom lasts for a short time, 2000 to 1800, and I'm not going to say much about that. Again, if you want to look up and research any of these periods, you can do that via scholarly articles or looking things up on Google for scholarly articles. Now, the second intermediate period, however, is significant for our reading of the Old Testament. What happens during the second intermediate period is Egypt is invaded by a group of people that later Egyptians called the Hyksos, shepherd kings, who had a capital in Avaris in the Delta region. And the Hyksos were persons from Syria, Palestine, that raided Egypt, conquered Egypt, and took control of Egypt or at least the Delta region of Egypt for almost 300 years. And it makes sense that this is a backdrop for the time in which Israel would have come into Egypt under Joseph. Again, we put a question mark because there was no Joseph was here documents or monuments, but it does make sense that how is it that a Joseph could have risen up in an administration? Probably Joseph was able to rise up during this Hyksos period. We can read his story in this context. And it also makes sense that when the beginning of Late Bronze, the Egyptians are going to push out the Hyksos, that would make sense how we can understand why the book of Exodus talks about a Pharaoh who knows or knew not Joseph and then enslaved the Egyptians. So this looks like a potential time period where we can understand how it is that God's people made it peacefully into Egypt, and then we can also explain why they would have later been enslaved when there was a regime change. Now in Syria-Palestine, this was a time when Syria-Palestine was perhaps the strongest of these regions. Most of ancient history, we're going to have either powers in Mesopotamia or in Egypt, but during the Middle Bronze, Syria-Palestine was powerful, and they had massive walled cities. When you read our textbook, some of the issues with the archaeology at Jericho have to do with the dating of the walls, because during the Middle Bronze period, Jericho had great walls. As you know from your reading, the initial archaeologists who dug at Jericho misidentified Middle Bronze walls or misidentified the Middle Bronze walls as the walls that were standing when Joshua went there. But we have multiple walled city-states in Syria, Palestine. There was time, and they had enough power then to launch an invasion and to control the Delta region of Egypt. So what's going on here? It looks like this is the time where we find the age of Israel's ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Israel's on the scene now. Again, that shouldn't bother you because remember, God is using Israel to bring about salvation to all the nations of Genesis 1 to 11. So it makes sense that there were people all over the place before God takes an action here. Now, this also explains, we can understand the Hebrews are in Egypt during this period. Now, let me mention one site, Nuzi. Nuzi was a mid-2nd century city in the Syria region of northern Mesopotamia. And Nuzi is significant because there was an archive found there, and some of the documents mention things that have parallels with what we see in the book of Genesis, especially chapters 12 to 50. For example, we have this wife-sister parallel text in Nuzi, and you recall that Abraham and Isaac both claimed that their wife was in fact their sister. We have levirate marriage. That's the practice where when a man dies without sons, the man's brother marries the wife, and then that his initial son is counted as the deceased. And also we see in Nuzi the freedom to give blessings to any child, which again perhaps a backdrop for what happens with Isaac and Jacob and Esau. All right, let's go to late bronze. And this is where things kind of heat up and are kind of exciting. Now in Mesopotamia, this is a period of decline, though we see here the rise of Assyria. And Assyria is going to be the dominant power once we get into the Middle Iron phase, or Iron II phase, down around 900 to 600 BC. But this is just the initial rise of the Assyrians in northern Mesopotamia. The Babylonians are in the south, the Assyrians are in the north. So the power base moves west, and the powers are going to be in Egypt. And this is New Kingdom Egypt. This is the age of empire. And New Kingdom Egypt begins with the expulsion of the Hyksos. Again, a traumatic invasion, a traumatic time for the Egyptians when they were controlled by a foreign power. So when the Egyptians push out these foreigners, probably makes sense of Israel being enslaved at this time, but essentially the Egyptians say this is never going to happen again. And so for the first time in Egyptian history, Egypt builds an empire and begins to take its forces across the Sinai Peninsula and up into Syria, Palestine to create a buffer zone. And simultaneously, the Hittites from Turkey are coming down south. And so the Egyptians and the Hittites run into each other in Syria, Palestine. And depending on who was stronger, that border region would move north or south. So it created a lot of chaos and mixed loyalties among the city-states in Syria, Palestine. And there's several battles that took place between the Egyptians and the Hittites, as well as some covenants that were made. And we're going to see later on that the idea of covenant in the Old Testament has some parallels with Hittite covenant treaties from this time period. One of the more famous pharaohs from late bronze was Akhenaten, or Amenhotep IV, 1349 to 32. He's known as the heretic pharaoh because he was a monotheist. He tried to abolish traditional Egyptian religions in favor of worshiping one god, the Aten. That's the last four letters of Akhenaten's name. He worshiped the Aten, which was the solar disk. So like the circular part of the sun, that was God for Akhenaten. And there's always debates to what extent, if any, there was any influence between Moses and Akhenaten, or Akhenaten and Moses, again, depending on how you date Moses. The Amarna letters are a significant archaeological discovery that goes back to this time around Akhenaten's father, Akhenaten himself, and then Akhenaten's successor. The Amarna letters were found in the new capital that Akhenaten built. And these letters are important because they give a sense of the context of the 14th century. And the Amarna letters have documents and letters between the Egyptian pharaohs and other powers, including kings from like Jerusalem and other cities in Syria, Palestine. So we'll say more about that in just a minute. Akhenaten's son was King Tut, perhaps the most famous of the pharaohs, simply due to the fact that all his treasures were discovered. But King Tut returned Egyptian religion to its traditions, so he took the name, a more traditional name, Tutankhamun, but he had a short reign. The Exodus occurs during the Late Bronze Age. It's recorded in Exodus 1 to 15. The problem is that the dating is difficult. The Bible consistently claims that its descendants were delivered from Egyptian bondage, but outside the Bible, there's really no direct evidence that it happened. Again, this doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It's just simply not documented. And why would the Egyptians have documented that, hey, we were defeated by a group of escaped slaves? So the Pharaoh's not going to write that, so there's no surprise that there's not documentation. Though there is some indirect evidence from Egyptian sources. We know that the Egyptians did chase slaves into the desert. We know that the Egyptians fortified what the Bible calls the way of the Philistines, so it makes sense that Israel went through the wilderness to escape. We know that the Egyptians enslaved Semitic peoples, so there's lots of indirect evidence of the historicity of the Exodus, but no direct evidence. Now, the dates for the Exodus, there's two that mostly evangelicals debate. This is, as you know from our reading, most of the historical events in the Old Testament are contested, but among evangelicals who look at the evidence, there's essentially two dates that are possible. There's the early date, should be the 15th century, and its biblical support is really 1 Kings 6:1 that talks about it was 480 years after Israel comes out of Egypt that King Solomon built the temple. So that would, if King Solomon builds a temple around 960 approximately, that would give us an early date for the Exodus of around 1440 BC. And it's just so happens that there is a pharaoh that reigned approximately that time who had a long reign, and as we know from Exodus, the pharaoh of the Exodus ruled for a long time, so it's possible that we could find the early date for the Exodus during the reign of Thutmose III. The late date would be the 13th century, and if you've watched most of the modern movies rooted in the Exodus, whether it's the cartoon The Prince of Egypt or the Ten Commandments or the newer movies, it's Ramses II is usually assumed to be the pharaoh, and he also had a long reign. So that gives us two possible dates. Again, you can read various evangelical takes on the Exodus, and there's good evidence both ways, though I would say that most evangelical scholars are now leaning towards the late date for the Exodus. A significant piece of archaeological data is the Merneptah stele. And in fact, I would call this the most significant piece of archaeological data from the ancient Near East because it's the earliest, it contains the earliest reference to Israel in anything outside of the Bible itself. And Merneptah claims to have taken a campaign into Syria, Palestine, and the word Israel is there, and Merneptah claims to have laid waste to Israel's seed and marks Israel as a people group. So in Syria, Palestine, they're caught in the crossfire between the Hittites and Egypt. Also want to mention Ugarit in the lecture, The Song of the Sea and the Subversion of Canaanite Myth. We talk a little bit about the city of Ugarit and its significance as an archive. The Amarna letters are important because they contain correspondence that gives us a sense of what's going on historically and politically in the 14th century in Syria, Palestine, either when Israel is coming into the land, if you go with an early date of the Exodus, or right in the centuries right before Israel enters the land, if you go with the late date for the Exodus. Say something more about the Amarna letters. They were written in Akkadian, but the language is a precursor to biblical Hebrew in some places. And there's letters from Jerusalem, Bethel, and Hebron. The Exodus and settlement probably takes place or begins to take place in the late Bronze Age. If you're interested in the historicity of the Exodus and settlement, there's lots of good resources, but it is clear that in the early decades after 1200 that there are numerous new settlements in Palestine, and many scholars would seek to find the Israelites among those groups that are settling. Period of Judges also takes place, again, depending on how you date the Exodus. If you go with a late date for the Exodus, the period of the Judges is going to move into the early Iron phase. So there's lots of dislocated people towards the end of the late Bronze Age. These were called Apiru or Abiru. It's a word that may be related to the word Hebrew. Now, the key thing is not to argue that every time an ancient Near Eastern text says Apiru that it's a Hebrew, but it's possible to find the Hebrews in this whole group of dislocated people that begin to move into more settled areas during this time. In Ugarit, significant. We know a lot about the god Baal, the religion, the religious milieu, worldviews that were present when Israel comes into the land. Also gives us an understanding of the pagan religions that the Old Testament essentially is interacting with in the way that it portrays and tells the stories about Yahweh and what Yahweh does. Now, at the end of 1200, all across the ancient Near East, the major civilizations crumble, and whether it's there's natural disasters and other things, but one of the things that certainly happens is the arrival of the Sea Peoples. These groups move in. They're probably from the Greeks. They're probably Greek persons, but some of the Sea People, one group that you know very well would be the Philistines. And the Philistines come into the scene, and they gain a foothold. They actually attack Egypt, but they gain a foothold. But the Sea Peoples weaken and devastate. The Hittites disappear. The Egyptians are weakened, and as we said, the Philistines are going to get a foothold even in Syria, Palestine. And all major powers collapse across the ancient Near East, so there's a vacuum. And we're going to see the next period, in the early Iron period, Iron 1, that there's a vacuum of power which allows smaller kingdoms to rise back up. Ramses III in 1177 mentions a group called the Peliset among these Sea Peoples, and these would be the Philistines, which is kind of cool. So the Philistines are an outside people group that moves into the ancient Near East and becomes a significant opponent of Israel. Okay, Iron 1, power vacuum. And this is the age of small or petty kingdoms. The period of the Judges would be located here, in the united monarchy of Saul, David, and Solomon, if you know the stories from 1 Samuel all the way through 1 Kings 11. Iron 2, the dominating force, or what's known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. We mentioned back in late Bronze that the Assyrians rise up as a significant people group in Mesopotamia. It's during this Iron 2 period that they become the masters of the ancient Near East. They conquer the Babylonians. They move into Syria, Palestine. They move a little bit east, and their force ultimately spreads and their influence even over Egypt. So essentially, for these 3 centuries, almost the entire Iron 2 period, the Neo-Assyrians control, or at least are the dominant force in the ancient Near East. This is also the period in which there are 2 Israels, the kingdom split. If you remember the story of Rehoboam, after the death of Solomon, Rehoboam blunders, overextends his power, and the northern tribes break off from Judah and Benjamin under the leadership of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And though in the books of Kings, all the northern kings are evil, it's actually the northern kingdom that's more significant politically, and it's going to last from around 931 or 922, depending on dates, down to the 722 BC when the Assyrians destroy the northern kingdom. That was under Shalmaneser V. And at that point, the northern kingdom disappears. People are exiled, and they are just essentially lost. Now, a miracle happens. About 20 years after the fall of Samaria, there's another major Assyrian campaign against now the rebellious Judahites under Hezekiah. But as you may know from the stories in Isaiah and also in 2 Kings, Jerusalem is spared, and Hezekiah is miraculously delivered by God from the hands of the Assyrians, who have to withdraw all the way back to Assyria in 701. And so that in many ways vindicated the southern kingdom. And we'll talk more about that as we go through our review of the scripture later in this class. So Jerusalem is vindicated. And we can also assume then that any refugees from the north would have moved down into the southern kingdom to take refuge with their brothers and sisters in the south. The first dominant force in Iron III were the Babylonians. Under their general Nebuchadnezzar, who becomes the second emperor, the Babylonians rebel against the Assyrians and ultimately destroy the Neo-Assyrian Empire and essentially take it over. So they control the same region as the Assyrians, all the way to Egypt. But as you can see from the dates, they were able to flex their muscles only for a short time, and essentially the Neo-Babylonian Empire was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's father reigned till 604, but again, Nebuchadnezzar was the great general who won the victories for his father, and as you can see, the empire only lasted about 17 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar is the one responsible for destroying Jerusalem and exiling several groups of Jews to Babylon. The second dominant force in Iron III was the Persian Empire. And the Persians had an empire that lasted a couple of hundred years. The Persians, or the Medo-Persian Empire, were persons coming out of what would be modern Iran, and their empire went from essentially western parts of India and extended all the way up into Turkey, all the way into Egypt. And if you know your wider history, you know the Persians actually attempted to conquer even the Greek islands, and where you have some of the more famous stories about the Greek resistance to the Persians. But the Persians were known as a kinder empire, and compared to the Babylonians and the Assyrians, who were ferocious and violent. Again, the Persians could be just as violent, but they tended to be a little lenient with their subjects. Their famous first ruler was Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus the Great defeated the Babylonians, and it's under Cyrus that he issued a decree releasing the Jews under Sheshbazzar to go back to their land and actually build a temple. And the Persians were lenient about that. You could worship your own gods, you could practice your own religion, as long as you always prayed for the Persian emperor first in your prayers. And there's a document, it's known as the Cyrus Cylinder. Here's a picture of it that actually talks about this policy of allowing persons to have temples and to practice their own religion. This document doesn't directly mention the Jews, but if you look at like the book of Ezra, where you see a letter from the Persian king, it has, scholars believe it has some echoes to some of the ideas that were in this Cyrus Cylinder. So this is actually a really cool artifact. Now, what else happens in Iron III? We have the restoration of Judah. Under Sheshbazzar and the priest Joshua, the exiled Jews return to their homeland. They begin to build a second temple. They had permission to do that, but they meet resistance. And if you read Ezra, the work stops. Stops for about 17 years. We never hear from Sheshbazzar or Joshua again, but the temple is restarted under the leadership of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. And this time, the temple is completed, and this is the second temple. And the first temple was under Solomon around 960. It was destroyed in 587 by the Babylonians. This is the second temple. And so from this time till the time of Jesus, we talk about Second Temple Judaism. Again, Herod is going to do an upgrade on the temple during his time, but essentially from 516 onward, the temple stands until the Romans destroy it again in the 70s during the Jewish revolt. The walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt during reforms. Again, Nehemiah, Ezra were reformers. Ezra was about reading the law. Nehemiah was a governor who got permission to go back to Judah to help those returning from exile, and the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt. Malachi was the last of the writing prophets whose scriptures we preserve in the Old Testament around 400 BC. Now, this doesn't mean that there's nothing happening after 400 BC in terms of the Old Testament. The documents that we have, at least the prophets and the Torah, are completed, but the books like the wisdom literature, the Psalms, and certain smaller books would have been completed during the time after this, and most importantly, these books would be canonized. So this wasn't a dead period here, but this was the time after which Malachi, that was the last of the prophets, until essentially John the Baptist shows up. This is the rise of classical Judaism, often called Second Temple Judaism, and we'll see the different flavors of Judaism that emerged from 400 till the time of Jesus to create the conflicts that were on the ground when Jesus the Messiah is born. During the Persian era, the Persian rule came to an end in 332 when Alexander the Great led an army into Asia and defeated the Persians, and Alexander was greeted as a conquering hero or a liberator. And essentially, Alexander took over the Persian Empire. And if you know the story, as a very young man, he got as far as the Indus River in India before dying. In his death, his kingdom dissolved into 4 pieces, ruled by his 4 generals. For our purposes, the most important of these 4 generals was General Ptolemy, and his descendants, the Ptolemies, ruled in Egypt, and the Seleucids ruled in Syria, Palestine. The most famous of the Ptolemies was probably Queen Cleopatra, who was significant in the century before Jesus. During the Greco-Roman phase, with the invasion of Alexander, they brought Greek civilization, the process of Hellenization, which came into serious conflict with Jews and Orthodox practices. At this time, the Jewish state was a temple state. Life was organized around the temple, and the temple was used as a center in which taxes could be raised to pay to the governors. Again, Israel is not free from their defeat by the Babylonians until what we're going to see in a little bit in mid-2nd century, the Maccabean revolt. A Seleucid ruler by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who came to reign around 175, is responsible for the conflict that led to the Maccabean revolt by God's people. Antiochus was an extreme anti-Semite, and he did atrocities like making rabbis eat pigs, persecuted Jews, and he ultimately sacrificed illegitimately in the temple itself, which is known as the abomination that causes desolation. The Maccabees revolted. These were freedom fighters, revolted against the Seleucids, and they fought a war, as you can see, for 25 years before getting their freedom. They cleansed the temple. That's where Hanukkah comes from in 164, and restarted the temple service. And in the wake of the revolt, Jewish people, God's people, had a brief, approximately 80-year time period in which they had independence again, though the dream of a Jewish state ended up very quickly disintegrating into corruption. And this is the time period where the Pharisees arise as opponents to the Hasmoneans. And the Hasmoneans' descendants were essentially the Sadducees. The Hasmoneans organized things around the priesthood, and they had control of the temple. The Romans ended any illusion that God's people would have autonomy. The Romans had been expanding the Roman Republic had been expanding since hundreds of years before this, and they become the dominant force worldwide, Europe, North Africa, and much of Western Asia. And in 63 BC, they conquer Syria, Palestine, with the general famously going into the temple. Caesar Augustus is the famous emperor of Rome who takes over from 31 BC to AD 14. He's the ruler that under whom Jesus is born, that Luke so aptly contrasts. Jesus' low birth with Caesar Augustus's splendor that he lived in. And this sets the stage for the New Testament, which can be picked up in a New Testament introduction class. But essentially what we want to see coming out of the Old Testament is the problem of exile. God's people have returned, but they're not really free, which sets the stage for Messiah, sets the stage for the fulfillment of prophetic expectations of redemption, of a new king, of the suffering servant from Isaiah, for a valley of dry bones coming back to life, all the wonderful images of God's kingdom emerging out of the prophetic writings, and wondering, when will God restore David's kingdom? As we know from the New Testament, those things are going to be fulfilled in the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. If you have any questions, post them. I'm Brian Russell. Thanks for listening.